Hello, my name is Alif Rafindiga Zulgari. I'm from FFA Research Consulting, and I'm going to present the first chapter in this presentation. Research Design, the overview. This is the design in the research process. As you can see from the proposal approved, it then goes to research design strategy, where data collection, design, and sampling design will then become the instrument development. Okay, so there are many definitions of research design, but there is no single definition in part the full range of the important aspects. The important aspects is such research design constitutes the blueprint for the collection, measurement, and analysis of data. It aids the researcher in the allocation of limited resources by posing crucial choices in methodology. Research design is the plan and structure of investigation, so conceived as to obtain answers to research questions. And research design expresses both the structure of the research problem and the plan of investigation used to obtain empirical evidence on those relationships. Okay, from the previous points, they altogether give the essentials of research design. Uh, so research design is the activity and time-based plan. A plan always based on the research question, a guide for selecting resources and types of information, a framework for specifying the relationship among the study's variables, and a procedural outline for every research activity. Okay, so this is critical path method, the CPM. I'm only going to talk about the critical path, which is the start, then goes to 1, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, and the end. Okay, from the start, we have to do client interviews, and from there we conduct exploratory interviews, and then we complete questionnaire, field interviewing, code data and analyze, which is the final check of background records. Then we have to write report, and for the end we have to meet the client. Okay, so this is the classification of designs. The first one is degree of research question crystallization. Okay, so it's divided to two. The first one is exploratory studies, where the purpose of exploitation is usually to develop hypotheses or question for further research. The second one is formal study. So the goal is to test the hypothesis or answer the research questions posed. The exploratory formal study is less precise than some of other classification. Okay, the next design is method of data collection. Okay, so it distinguishes between monitoring and communication process. So in monitoring, it includes studies in which the researcher inspects the activities of a subject. While in the communication study, the researcher questions the subject and collects the response by personal or impersonal means. Next one is researcher control of variables. Okay, so they're also divided to two. The first one is experiment, where the researcher attempts to control or manipulate the variable in the study. The second one is ex post facto design. The investigators have no control over the variables in the sense of being able to manipulate them. Okay, so the next design of the purpose of the study. There are four types. The first one is reporting study. It provides a summation of data, often recasting data to achieve a deeper understanding or to generate statistics for comparison. The second one is descriptive. So it is when the research is concerned with finding out who, what, where, when, or how much. The third one is causal explanatory. So when a study is concerned with learning why, it's causal explanatory. The last one is causal predictive. So the study attempts to predict an effect on one variable by manipulating another variable while holding all other variables constant. The next design is time dimension. It's divided to two. The first one is cross-sectional studies. Uh, it carried what out once and represent a snapshot of one point in time. The second one is longitudinal studies. They are repeated over an extended period. The next design is topical scope. The first one is statistical studies, which are designed for breadth rather than depth. Uh, then the next one is case studies. It places more emphasis on a full contextual analysis of fewer events and their interrelations. Okay, the next one is research environment. For this research, we must use simulations. Simulations are increasingly used in research, especially in operations research. The next design is participants' perceptual awareness. There are three levels of perception. The first one being participants perceive no deviations from everyday routines. The second one is participants perceive deviations, but as unrelated to the researcher. The third one is participants perceive deviations as researcher induced. Okay, so the next studies is exploratory studies. Uh, it is basically qualitative techniques. So here is the difference between quality and quantity. Quality is the essential character or nature of something, while quantity is the amount. Qualitative is the what, quantity is the how much. Qualitative refers to the meaning, while quantitative assumes the meaning and refers to a measure of it. Okay, so this is several approaches which are adaptable for exploratory investigations. Here are the points. Okay, with those approaches combined, we will have four exploratory techniques. The first one is secondary data analysis. The second one is experience surveys. The next one is focus groups. And last but not least, two-stage designs. Then we have the next studies, which is descriptive studies. It typically structured with clearly stated hypotheses. Uh, these formal studies serve a variety of research objectives. The first one is description of phenomena associated with a subject population, which is the who, what, when, where, and how of the topic. The next objectives is estimates of the proportion of populations that have these characteristics. And the last objectives is discovery of associations among different variables. Okay, so these descriptive studies are often much more complex. To give you a picture, the simplest descriptive study concern an unvariate question or hypothesis in which we ask about or state something about the size, form, distribution, or existence of a variable. The next studies is causal studies. We will have three relationships in this study. The first one is a symmetrical relationship, which is one in which two variables fluctuate together, but we assume that the changes in neither variable are due to the change in the other. The next relationship is reciprocal relationship. It exists when two variables mutually influence or reinforce each other. The last one is asymmetrical relationship. We postulate that changes in one variable are responsible for changes in the other variable.
Uh, the next part is theoretical framework and hypothesis development. First of all, theoretical framework represents the belief in how certain phenomena are related to each other and an explanation of why you believe that these variables are associated with each other. So both model and the theory flow logically from the documentation of previous research in the problem area. So there are three of the process of building a theoretical framework. There are introducing definition of the concept or variables in your model, developing a conceptual model that provides a descriptive representation of your theory, and coming up with a theory that provides an explanation for the relationship between the variables in your model. Since a theoretical framework involves the identification of the network of relationship among the variables, it is essential what a variable means and what the different types of variables are. There are four main types of variables. First one is dependent variables, independent variables, the moderating variables, and the mediating variables. The dependent variable is the variable of primary interest to the researcher. Their goal is to understand and describe the dependent variable or to explain its variability predicate. In other words, it is the main variable that lends itself for investigation as a viable factor. Through the analysis of the dependent variable, example like finding what variable influence it and so forth, it is possible to find answer or solution to the problem. The second one is independent variable. Independent variable is one that influences the dependent variable in either positive or negative way. When a dependent variable is present, the dependent variable is also present, and with each unit of increase in the independent variable, there is an increase or decrease in the dependent variable. In other words, the variance in the dependent variable is accounted for by the independent variable. To establish that a change in the independent variable causes a change in the dependent variable, all four of the following conditions should be met. There are the independent and dependent variables should cover a change in a dependent variable should be associated with a change in the independent variable. The independent variable should precede the dependent variable. In other words, there must be a time sequence which the two occur. The cause must occur before the event. No other factor should be a possible cause of the change in a dependent variable. So the researcher should control for the effects of other variables. And a logical explanation is needed and it must explain why the independent variables affect the dependent variables. The third one, the moderating variable, it has a strong contingent effect on the independent variable and dependent variable relationship. The presence of a third variable modifies the original relationship between the independent and dependent variables. And the last variable is mediating variable. It's one that surfaces between the time the independent variables start operating to influence the dependent variable and the time their impact is felt on it. There is a fierce temporal quality or time dimension. Another example uh, shown in this flowchart, the independent variable is the workforce diversity. Another example shown in this flow, the first one, independent variable as the workforce diversity. Managerial expertise is the moderating variable. Influence the independent variable and mediating variable, which mediating variable is creative synergy that influence the dependent variable, the organizational effectiveness. So, the independent variables helps to explain the variance in the dependent variable. The mediating variable surfaces at time t2 as a function of the independent variable, which also helps us to conceptualize the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. And the moderating variables has a contingent effect on the relationship between two variables between the mediating variables and the independent variables. So we move on to the next one. The next one is the components of the theoretical framework. A good theoretical framework identifies and defines how important variables in the situation that are relevant to the problem and subsequently describes and explains interconnecting amongst these variables. So there are three basic features that should be incorporated in this theoretical framework. The first one is the variable considered relevant to the study should be clearly defined. Next one, a conceptual model that describes the relationship between the variables in a model should be given. And the last, there should be a clear explanation of why we expect this relationship to exist. The next topic is about hypothesis development. So the basic of hypothesis is a proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further investigation. So there is a statement of hypothesis formats, and we can if there's statement. So a hypothesis can be defined as a testable statement of the relationship among variables. Also, it can be tested whether there are differences between two groups with respect to any variables. The second one is directional and non-directional hypothesis. So, when stating the relationship between two variables or comparing two groups, terms such as positive, negative, more than, less than, and the like are used. On the contrary, non-directional hypotheses are those that do assuming a relationship of differences between two variables. The third one is null and alternate hypothesis. As we learned on the statistical, on the second semester and the first semester, move on into the next one, step of hypothesis testing. In doing so, you have to state the null and the alternate hypothesis first. Then choose the appropriate statistical test depending on whether the data collected are parametric or non-parametric. Then you have to determine the level of significant desired. The last one is see if the output results from the computer analysis indicate that the significant level is met. The next one will be explained by my colleagues.
Hello everyone, my name is Fadi Fadian and now I would like to present and give explanation about the elements of research design. First thing first, what is a research design? A research design is a blueprint or plan for the collection, measurement, and analysis of data created to answer your research questions. There are a lot of elements of a research design. First, we have a research strategy in which will help you to meet your research objectives and to answer the research questions of your study. The choice for a research strategy will depend on the research objective and the type of research questions of your study, but also on your viewpoint on what makes good research and on practical aspects such as access to data sources and time constraints. Next, we have experiments. Those are usually associated with a hypothetical deductive approach to research. The purpose of an experiment is to study causal relationships between variables. Experimental designs are less useful or appropriate for answering exploratory and descriptive research questions. In an experiment, the researcher manipulates the independent variable to study the effect of this manipulation on the variable, or to see changes between a certain variable to a certain variable. For example, like a reward system to stabilize whether those rewards will change a rate of productivity in an office. Next, we have survey research, which is a system for collecting information from or about people to describe, compare, or explain their knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. This strategy is very popular in business research because it allows the researcher to collect quantitative and qualitative data on many types of research questions.
Indeed, surveys are commonly used in exploratory and descriptive research to collect data about people, events, or situations. For example, in a business context, surveys are often taken on the subject of consumer decision making, job satisfaction, the use of health services, management information system, and etc. Next, we have ethnography, which is explained by Marcus and Fisher. They say that ethnography is a closely observed, records, and engages in the daily life of another culture, and then writes accounts of this culture, emphasizing descriptive detail. This ethnography involves immersion in the particular culture of the social group that is being studied, observing their behavior, listening to what is said in conversations, and asking questions. It aims to generate an understanding of the culture and behavior of a social group from an insider's point of view. Next, we have case studies, which is collecting information about a specific object, event, or activity, such as a particular business unit or organization. In case studies, the case is the individual, the group, the organization, the event, or the situation the researcher is interested in. The idea behind a case study is that in order to obtain a clear picture of a problem, one has to examine the real-life situation from various angles and perspectives using multiple methods of data collection. Next, we have grounded theory, which is a systematic set of procedures to develop an inductively derived theory from the data. Important tools of grounded theory are theoretical sampling, coding, and constant comparison. Theoretical sampling is the process of data collection for generating theory, whereby the analyst jointly collects, codes, and analyzes the data and decides what data to collect next and where to find them in order to develop his theory as it emerges. Next, we have action research, which is sometimes undertaken by consultants who want to initiate change processes in organizations. In other words, action research is a research strategy aimed at affecting plant changes. Here, the researcher begins with a problem that is already identified and gathers relevant data to provide a tentative problem solution. This solution is then implemented with the knowledge that there may be unintended consequences following such implementation. The effects are then evaluated, defined, and diagnosed, and the research continues on and on until the problem is fully resolved. The extent of interference by the researcher has a direct bearing on whether the study undertaken is correlational or causal. These are the varying degrees of interference by the researcher. There are minimal, moderate, and excessive. Whereas minimal is conducted in a natural environment, like supermarket or the factory flow, with minimal interference by the researcher with the normal flow of event. Whereas in moderate and excessive, the researcher tries to manipulate certain variables so as to study the effects of such manipulation on the dependent variable of interest. These are the examples of minimal interference, moderate, and excessive. I suggest you guys to pause or screenshot this to have a better understanding of these three. Next, we have study setting. There are two study settings, which is contrived and non-contrived. Contrived is where the environment settings is artificial, while non-contrived is the natural one. A contrived setting of environment is usually used to to study exploratory and descriptive studies, while natural setting of environment is used to the causal ones. Then next we have the unit of analysis is the major entity that you are analyzing in your study. For instance, any of these following could be unit of an analysis study. We have individuals here, groups, organizations, diets, or two people in the group basically, and cultures. If you are comparing the children in two classrooms on achievement test scores, the unit is the individual child because you have a score for each child. On the other hand, if you are comparing the two classes on classroom climate, your unit of analysis is the group, in this case the classroom, because you only have a classroom climate score for the class as a whole and not for each individual student. Next we have two time horizon, which is cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. The cross-sectional studies is a study that can be undertaken in which the data are gathered just once, perhaps over a period of days or week or months, in order to answer research questions. The purpose of the studies in the following examples was to collect data that were pertinent to finding the answer to research question. Data collection at one point in time was sufficient. Both were cross-sectional design. And next we have longitudinal studies. Is where data on the dependent variable are gathered or at two or more points in time to answer the research question. Because in some cases, the researcher might want to study people or events or phenomena at more than one point in time in order to answer the research questions. For example, like if the researcher wants to study employees' behavior before and after a change in the top management. So there are two different time points. Next we have mixed methods. It aims to answer research questions that cannot be answered by qualitative or quantitative approaches alone. It focuses on collecting, analyzing, and mixing both quantitative and qualitative data in a single study or series of studies. This approach allows researchers to combine inductive and deductive thinking, to use more than one research method to address the research problem, and to solve this problem using different types of data. Next, triangulation is a technique that is also often associated with using mixed methods. The idea of this triangulation is that one can be more confident in a result if the use of different methods or sources leads to the same results. Triangulation requires that research is addressed from multiple perspectives. So these are several kinds of triangulations. We have method triangulation, which is using multiple methods of data collection and analysis. We have the data triangulation, which is collecting data from several sources or at different time periods. And we also have researcher triangulation. We have multiple researchers collect and or analyze the data. And last, we have theory triangulation, where we have multiple theories and or perspectives are used to interpret and explain the data. Next we have, so there are trade-offs and compromises in a research design, because sometimes because of the time and cost involved, a researcher might be constrained to settle or to less than the ideal research design. For example, the researcher might have to conduct a cross-sectional instead of a longitudinal study, or to do a field study rather than an experimental design, choose a smaller sample size rather than a larger sample size, and so on. This sub-optimizing the research design decisions and settling for a lower level of scientific methods because of resource constraints. This trade-off will be a deliberate and conscious decision made by the manager or the researcher himself or herself, and have to compromise to explicitly stated in the research report. Knowledge about research designs helps the manager to understand what the researcher is attempting to do. Fully understanding the differences between causal and correlational studies is important so that the managers do not fall into trap of making implicit causal assumptions when two variables are only associated with each other. Now we have quantitative research questions and hypotheses. In quantitative, the researcher inquires about the relationships among variables that the researcher wants to know. And quantitative hypotheses are prediction the researcher makes about the expected outcomes of relationships among variables. This is the example of quantitative research questions, and the example, the hypothesis, is also in this picture. And these are the guidelines for writing good quantitative research questions and hypotheses. The use of variable in research questions or hypotheses is typically limited to three basic approaches. First, first thing to do is the researcher may compare groups on an independent variable to see its impact on the dependent variables. Second, the investigator may relate one or more independent variables to one or more dependent variables. Third, the researcher may describe responses to the independent, mediating, or dependent variables. And the most rigorous form of quantitative research follows from a test of a theory and the specification of research questions or hypotheses that logically followed from the relationship among variables in the theory. The independent and dependent variables must be measured separately and not measured on the same concept. This procedure reinforces the cause and effect logic of quantitative research. To eliminate redundancy, write only research questions or hypotheses, not both, unless the hypothesis built on the research questions. Choose the form based on tradition, recommendations from an advisor or faculty committee, or whether past research indicates a prediction about outcomes. If hypotheses are used, there are two forms, A, null, and B, alternative. A null hypothesis represents the traditional approach. It makes a prediction that in the general population, no relationship or no significant difference exists between groups on a variable. The wording is there is no difference or relationship between the groups. The alternative is directional hypothesis. The researcher makes a prediction about the expected outcome, basing this prediction on prior literature and studies on the topic that suggests a potential outcome. For example, the researcher may predict that scores will be higher for group A than for group B on the dependent variable, or that group A will change more than group B on the outcome. These examples illustrate a directional hypothesis because an expected prediction is made. There's also another type of alternative statement is the non-directional hypothesis, in which a prediction is made but the exact form of differences is not specified because the researcher does not know what can be predicted from past literature. Thus, the investigator might write, "There is a difference between the two groups." And I think the rest of it, you can read it yourself because I think it's self-explanatory. Next, we have a model for descriptive questions and hypotheses. Basically, it's a model for writing questions or hypotheses based on writing descriptive questions, followed by inferential questions or hypotheses. These are the example of descriptive questions and hypotheses in the picture below. And in mixed methods research questions and hypotheses, researchers should consider 1. Both qualitative and quantitative research questions need to be advanced in a mixed method study in order to narrow and focus the purpose statement. 2nd is to follow the guidelines. 3. Some attention should be given to the order of the research questions and hypotheses. 4. In addition to quantitative questions and hypotheses and qualitative questions, include a mixed methods research question that directly address the mixing of the quantitative and qualitative strands of the research. 5. The mixed methods question can be written in different ways. 6. Consider how to present the quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method questions in a mixed method study. That is all for me. Thank you very much.